One of the most shocking days in the history of music was December 8, 1980, when John Lennon was murdered by Mark David Chapman. As John Lennon went throughout his day, Mark David Chapman was working to execute a plan he'd considered for quite some time. It's now been over 40 years since the murder. As Mark David Chapman serves a life sentence and keeps demanding parole, we can't get this harrowing event out of our minds. Join Facts First to learn about how John Lennon lived during his final hours. John Lennon's influence. When the Beatles broke up, many music fans felt they would never experience the genius of the Fab Four again. But the four members went their separate ways and all had successful solo careers. John Lennon perhaps became even more iconic than when he was with the Beatles. He became one of the most influential artists while he was still a member of the Beatles, and many of his songs and views struck a chord with the youth from around the world. Among those who didn't care for his music was the US government, and it seems he knew exactly what was happening. But what was so good or bad about John Lennon's music that it upset some people? Perhaps the most famous was his song Imagine, in which he envisions his ideal world. One of the most famous or perhaps infamous lines is when he sings about imagining a world without religion and one where there's no heaven, and above us there's nothing but the sky. While such words may bring solace to some, they bring fury to others. Many didn't like John's overtly atheistic stance, and many saw this as a stance against Christianity. It didn't help that with the Beatles, John Lennon was instrumental in popularizing Eastern spirituality and religion in the West. At one point during the Beatles' fame, John Lennon joked that the Beatles were even more famous than Jesus, which enraged a lot of people. It also got a few concerts canceled. While he was adored by many fans, he had unwittingly made a few enemies as well. While we might think music is simply entertainment, it's important to remember art has a greater influence on our collective psyche. Lyrics from a great song can inspire and influence people, and many others might not be comfortable with how someone might act after hearing a song like Imagine. There were people who felt John Lennon was a dangerous influence on American and perhaps Western society at large. Particularly a small populace of religious fanatics felt truly hurt by Lennon's music and his influence. Among such people, there was one who was previously a huge Beatles fan and a fan of Lennon. He loved listening to Lennon's music and felt joy when he heard it. But he underwent a religious conversion and this time became even more obsessed with John Lennon. He felt John had to be silenced lest he cause even more harm on society. Enter Mark David Chapman. Mark David Chapman was born May 10, 1955 in Fort Worth, Texas. His childhood wasn't easy, and he recalled having horrible experiences with his father, who was physically abusive to his mother and showed no affection towards Mark. This made Mark feel powerless and made him long for power, especially over others. As a teenager, he had a troubled life, often bullied in school. He experimented with drugs and even ran away from home and lived in Georgia for 2 weeks before returning to Texas. When he turned 16, he became a born-again Presbyterian, and this had a major influence on the rest of his life. He found solace in religion and would go around distributing biblical literature, finally finding purpose and a source of strength in life. But his conversion had a darker side as well. It meant Mark was disturbed by anything he considered blasphemous or against the message of the gospel. As a young teen, he, like many teens of his age, loved the Beatles and especially Lennon. But eventually his love for John Lennon turned into hate. He felt John would preach about having no possessions while living as a millionaire. He listened to John's music and feel angry that the singer didn't believe in God and seemed to openly criticize the concept of God and religion in his music. This rage turned into a plan to murder John Lennon. We can't continue without mentioning The Catcher in the Rye. The famous novel was a huge influence on Mark David Chapman, and he often claimed the novel made him want to commit the heinous murder. He felt a kinship with the novel's protagonist, Holden Caulfield. He felt he could live his life as Holden and fight against the quote-unquote phonies, which is often mentioned in the novel. One interesting point that should be noted is that Holden Caulfield also had an aversion to religion and even makes a blasphemous statement about Jesus in the novel. Nevertheless, Chapman loved the book and read it many times. Even after he had done the deed, the police found him sitting down reading it. The Catcher in the Rye was already considered a controversial novel and was now perhaps even more so. He decided to travel to New York where John Lennon lived. He carried along with him a copy of Catcher in the Rye and a .38 Special revolver. The morning of December 8, 1980, the world didn't know who Mark David Chapman was. Since that fateful day, it seems we'll never forget him. How John Lennon lived during his final hours. While John Lennon knew his music upset some people and that he was being surveilled by the government and was even threatened with deportation by President Nixon, his focus continued to be on his music. On December 8, 1980, John Lennon was just as busy as ever. He and his wife, Yoko Ono, were finalizing their song Walking on Thin Ice, which would then be released in February of 1981. One of the creepiest things about the recording of that particular song is the lyrics. On the song, Yoko Ono sang about how she might cry someday. Little did she know that she was about to experience one of the most traumatic events of her life. But recording that song wasn't the only thing keeping John busy on December 8th. In fact, even earlier during that day, he was busy giving an interview. He was interviewed by Dave Sholin and Lori Kay. In the interview, he discussed how he was perceived, and this had become a regular theme of his interviews. In fact, only a few days before this interview, he gave another one to Rolling Stone, where he addressed the backlash he faced after the Beatles broke up. He stated that the British public wanted a dead hero, such as Sid Vicious, but he himself refused to become a dead hero. In hindsight, how John Lennon lived during his final hours almost made it seem as if he knew that a great threat was on the way. Around 11 p.m. on December 8, 1980, John Lennon was shot and ultimately killed by Mark David Chapman outside of his apartment in New York City. When the police arrived to arrest the killer, he was sitting calmly at the scene reading The Catcher in the Rye. At Yoko Ono's request, all photographs of John Lennon's corpse were destroyed. One wonders how this would play out in the modern age when one can take and share photos in an instant. Mark David Chapman was given a sentence of 20 years to life with possibility of parole. While initially reluctant to speak to the press, he stated that he didn't want to kill John Lennon for the publicity. He has often requested parole, stating that his mental state was weak during the time. However, in 2022, he appealed for parole and stated that he knew killing John Lennon was wrong, but that he did, in fact, desire fame. He was denied parole on the grounds that the world was still recovering from his actions. He's scheduled to appeal for release the 13th time in February of 2024. Now it's time to hear from you. Are you a fan of John Lennon? Did you know about how he spent his final hours and the details leading to his assassination? Let us know in the comments section below.